Hi PCTI STEMers. This is the third video of this unit. This is once again on World War I or the Great War, and this is about trench warfare. So you can see here from this diagram that the trenches were basically dug into the ground as soldiers would try to advance to acquire more territory. There were over 25,000 miles of trenches in World War I. They're still finding some today as they build things like highways and things like that. Now, not all of them look exactly like this, but they would usually have like front lines and then their support lines, communication lines in the back. And the reason why soldiers were stuck in them for so long, especially on the Western Front, is that if they tried to advance, they would be shot down with machine guns and they wouldn't be able to take the next area. So the new technology of the Industrial Revolution really led to trench warfare. Now that area in between the trenches where no real side could advance, that was known as no man's land. So today I'm not going to teach you so much about the military tactics of the war, but of some of the problems that soldiers faced while being in the trenches. So not problems with machine guns or grenades, just problems with living in a trench. So the first one we're going to talk about, actually, let me just show you a few photos here first. Like I said, some had sandbags, some were wide, some were shallow. The first problem I'm going to talk to you about is lice. You can see here soldiers, and what they're doing is they're literally trying to just pick out and kill the lice in their clothing. 97% of all soldiers were infected at least once, but probably many more times, with lice during the war. So imagine you're trying to fight a war, and besides being shot at, you're worried about trying to get lice off your body and out of your clothes. Now they did try to treat it. They would bring the soldiers up, they'd remove their clothing and treat it with chemicals, and they took certain baths, but it was just a matter of time. All you needed was one, lice or one person next to you, because remember, it was very close quarters, and you would be reinfested. So the body lice would not only be problematic, as you can imagine, but it caused a sour, foul smell. The machines, as I mentioned, really were effective. And of course, the itching and scratching that was associated with it. And people would get trench fever from lice. It would cause pains in their back and in their shins and literally get fevers. And it easily hopped from one person to another. My son wanted to make sure we added that one in last night. Okay, now we also have the problem with trench rats. This was a problem in the Western Front, but also rats were problems in other parts of the war, like in Italy. There were other animals that they were concerned, frogs, certain beetles, but rats by far were the biggest issue. They were attracted to food scraps. There was really no efficient way to get rid of food waste during the war, but also decomposing bodies, right? The bodies would not be able to be removed right away. The rats tend to eat at the eyes first and then invade literally like into the skull. So imagine waking up and seeing that. 2 rats had the ability to produce 880 offspring a year. So you can see why that would be troublesome. And they couldn't just shoot at the rats because they needed to preserve their ammunition. They would take food out of pockets while people were asleep, or they would even gnaw on the injured. Imagine if you couldn't move your legs because you were, hurt in the war, and then it was literally gnawing at your feet. So here's some images of soldiers that caught rats. Now, I even found photos of them tanning rat hides, rat skins, and trying to use something out of this. Now, these rats, if you see there, that little doggy, that terrier actually got all those rats. So sometimes it was useful to have rat, terror type dogs in the trenches. Here's more with their prizes. This is a German picture. It says Mitbewohner des Schutzgrabens, and that's basically roommates of the ditches. or like, who was their roommate in the ditch? It was the rats. And then it says, Die großen Exemplar messen von Kopf bis Schwarzpeize 45 im Hintergrund die Ratfinger. So that first part says basically that it's an example, the largest example of the rat was 45 centimeters from head, that's Kopf, to its toe. And in the background is a man, Ratfinger, who I guess got them. So doesn't matter what side you're on. Doesn't matter if you're French or German, British or Austrian, they all dealt with rats. Another issue is trench foot. You can see here officers checking the feet of soldiers to make sure that they were okay. Now this, this photo almost looks like World War II, but no, it's a World War I photo. And trench foot was a fungal infection caused from the exposure of cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions. Now you see where the men's feet are? That's they had things called like duck boards that would sort of stick out of the trench, maybe to sit on, but also to stand, because what would happen, think of all this rain we've had in the past year. Every day this week, right, we've had these torrential downpours. Well, the weather we have inside is also the weather they had outside there in those trenches. So it would fill up with rain, snow. It would become muddy. And imagine standing in that all the time. It could turn gangrenous, that's gangrene, and sometimes it would lead to amputation. Other reasons why it becomes such a problem is because often their boots didn't fit, and that might cut into them a little bit. And sometimes from all the marching would cause blisters, so those wounds would cause infections even easier. Socks were changed several times a day. It was the only way to really avoid it, but this was impractical. Most soldiers didn't have several pairs of socks to change a day. There was no, there was no store to run to. There was no Amazon to deliver socks. There was no washer and dryer machine there to redo your socks. Another solution was the front lines would try to use gallons of whale oil a day to protect, and that would work, but only within reason, and only how much could you acquire. In 1914, alone, just 1 year, the British suffered 20,000 casualties just from trench foot. So not being shot by the enemy, just from your feet not being able to handle the conditions. And these are some awful pictures. This is from 2016, and this shows you, ones that were probably had to be amputated. So let me show you a little bit. I want to share some stories about, this is primary sources from people that were dealing with this. So the Lancashire Fusiliers, that's an image of them below. That's a unit that served in the Battle of the Somme, which is a very famous one, very deadly one, and many others. So Sergeant Harry Roberts was interviewed after the war, and he said, "If you never had trench foot described to you, I will tell you. Your feet swell to 2 or 3 times the normal size and go completely dead. You could stick a bayonet into them and not feel a thing. If you are fortunate enough not to lose your feet and the swelling begins to go down, it is then that the intolerable, indescribable agony begins. I have heard many men cry and even scream with their pain, and many had to have their feet and legs amputated." So once again, they weren't hurt by poisonous gas or the shelling of artillery, but from the conditions. Arthur Savage, another British soldier, had another story. He said, "My memories are of sheer terror and the horror of seeing men sobbing because they had trench foot that had turned gangrenous. They knew they were going to lose a leg. Memories of lice in your clothing driving you crazy, filth and lack of privacy. Of huge rats that showed no fear of you as they stole your food rations. And cold, deep, wet mud everywhere. And of course, corpses. I'd never seen a dead body before I went to war, but in the trenches the dead are lying all around you. You could be talking to the fellow next to you when suddenly he'd be hit by a sniper and fall dead beside you. And there he'd stay for days." Now, another issue was dysentery, which is basically diarrhea. And it's basically because there was a lack of proper latrines there, and cleanliness was an issue. So what happens is bacteria enters the body through maybe food you eat or through your mouth somehow. Also, there's contact with feces. Once I said, no proper latrines. Imagine if they dig a hole, but then artillery hits the hole and it sort of splatters everywhere, or other humans that had it. Victims then lost important salts and fluids from their body. Now, this is not new to warfare. I know soldiers in the war on terror today who suffered from it. Civil War soldiers suffered from it. So whenever you're out in these conditions, it happens. This is actually the gravestone of a French soldier who died from dysentery. And also, you have nutritional deficiencies because you're not eating well out there in the trenches, so that causes it to become more of a problem as well. So here's a story of that. Now you see that metal, it's an iron pot that they would use like for stew and things. They would call that a Dixie back then. So sometimes they would need to find ice to make tea. So if it was cold months and you find ice in the ground, you would chip it off and use it. Well, this is an example of how men could get dysentery. This is another soldier's story. An axe would be the means of filling the Dixies with lumps of ice. We used it for tea for several days until one chap noticed a pair of boots sticking out and discovered they were attached to a body. Another issue is shell shock. Now, I know you learned a little bit about this already from the Actively Learn activity, and I hope you watched like the video and read a little bit about that. But basically, shell shock was a form of a mental breakdown. Now, I'm not going to say that shell shock never existed before World War I, because I'm sure all soldiers in all wars had issues about all the awful conditions of war, like we mentioned. However, it started to be diagnosed as an issue in World War I. And let's admit, warfare changed a lot with World War I. The constant shelling, the artillery, this industrial warfare changed the way war was fought. So here's an example. Between 1914 and 1918, the British identified 80,000 of their soldiers, which is 2% of their active army, of suffering from shell shock. That's a pretty large percentage. And this is, some people say there was just, an underestimate of how many really suffered. And many refused to obey orders. They could not handle the potential death lying ahead of them. Others committed suicide. Some were killed by their own comrades if they were loud and didn't want to bring attention. Now, there is some physical concerns they expected of how this happened. They thought the brain could have been altered because of cerebral lesions from the constant shelling and the impact, sort of like shaken brain, like the brain injuries that soldiers face today from IED, and why we have so many issues of PTSD today. Also, they think maybe breathing in all that carbon monoxide from the shelling could have caused problems as well. 19 hospitals were set up in Britain alone to deal with soldiers who faced shell shock. The awful news is, it's already awful, but to make it even worse, that these soldiers did not ever receive pensions because they said their injuries were not war-related. They did not suffer, they were not shot with a weapon. And we all know that it's a very real injury from war. Here's another example of the electric shock treatments that we mentioned in the Actively Learn assignment, right? Luckily, PTSD is treated much better today, but as we learned in the news, still not well enough when we know the rate of suicide by our veterans is still so high. Here's one more soldier's story. It is heartbreaking to watch a shell shock case. The terror is indescribable. The flesh on their faces shakes in fear, and their teeth continually chatter. Shell shock was brought about in many ways. Loss of sleep, continually being under heavy shell fire, the torment of the lice, irregular meals, nerves always on end, and the thought always in the man's mind that the next minute was going to be his last. And this was by soldier Henry Gregory. Right? No real place to sleep in the trenches. And I'll leave you with that. We have one more video on World War I, and it will be on the technologies. If you have any questions and we want to talk about this next class, please don't hesitate to do so. See you then, guys.